Hi students, this is our first video in a new unit on the First Amendment, free speech, and the harm principle. In this unit we're going to take a look at the First Amendment's protection of liberty, right? Freedoms, and we're going to look at the justification for why people should be free to speak their mind, practice the religions they want to, assemble peacefully, that sort of thing. Now, in looking at that First Amendment, we're going to take a look at sort of maybe some of the philosophical ideas or principles that underlie that. In particular, we're going to look at Mill's harm principle, and he's going to show you why he thinks if we accept the harm principle, we should also protect speech and give people the free speech protections that are relatively strong, right, of the kind that we get in the US. Maybe Mill thinks that we should even have stronger free speech protections than we have in the US. So we're going to take a look at Mill's arguments in this video, but I think the important thing to do is to keep in mind that this discussion is happening in this sort of broader context where we're thinking about how free should people be within a society. How much freedom should we give them? When can we and should we limit their freedom? Okay. So let's take a look at the First Amendment here. And I've sort of put in white the important bits here, but I'm going to read the whole thing because it's worth it. You know, the First Amendment talks about a number of freedoms. We're going to focus on free speech and the free speech clause, but we shouldn't ignore the other freedoms protected here. Okay, so the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So in this First Amendment and the other Bill of Rights, right, what the founders were doing was they said, you know what, we want to make sure that there are just some things that the government can't do. We want to protect people. We want to give them rights that the government can't impede on or take away. And so we're going to set these down sort of once and for all, that Congress can't do X, Y, and Z. So abridging the freedom of speech is one of those things. That's the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Now, when we think about why would this be justified, why can't governments take away people's freedom of speech? If we look at John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, right, we're going to get an argument for why the government shouldn't be able to abridge people's freedom of speech. So in particular, we're going to look at what's called the liberty argument from On Liberty. In this excerpt, we want to ask what's Mill's thesis? What's he trying to convince us of? Whether you've read that the excerpt yet or not, something we always want to be thinking about, either going in or afterwards. What was this person trying to convince us of? What were they trying to get us to think? I think the main thing I would want you to take away, right, is this thesis Mill has that governments are justified in prohibiting behavior only if that behavior harms other people. So for some examples, right, murdering, stealing, things like that, those kinds of behaviors harm people, and so the government's justified in prohibiting them. But other things, right, like playing football in your backyard for fun, or drinking soda, things like that, they might harm you, right? Playing football, you could get hurt. Drinking soda, right, you might drink too much and become unhealthy. But those things only harm you. They don't harm other people. And so Mill thinks you can't prohibit those kinds of behaviors. Now this idea, this principle, becomes known as the harm principle. The government can't prohibit something unless it causes harm to other people. That's the harm principle. Mill's going to go from the harm principle to argue that governments are justified in protecting almost all speech, that they should protect almost all speech. And we just looked at the First Amendment, you might think the US is pretty good here. It does protect people's speech. I think it's possible that Mill might have wanted to go even farther than the US did in protecting speech. And not every country is like the US. So Australia, for example, doesn't have quite the same amount of free speech protections that we have in the US. And we want to be thinking about, exactly how far should those protections extend. So we'll be looking at Mill's argument for that. The basic idea behind that argument, right, is that, well, speech doesn't harm people. So if you can't prohibit something unless it harms other people, you can't prohibit speech, because speech doesn't harm other people. You all remember that famous saying, right, from when we were kids, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That kind of idea is maybe at the front of Mill's mind here, right? Speech can't hurt other people, so we shouldn't prohibit it. All right, let's take a look at the harm principle. Here's Mill's sort of explicit statement of the harm principle. He says the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against that person's will is to prevent harm to others. So you can't stop someone from doing something. You can't use force or power against someone's will unless what you're doing prevents harm to other people. That's the harm principle. So the first way I would put it here, the government is justified in prohibiting behavior only if that behavior harms others. The fact that an agent's action harms him or herself, whether physically or morally, is not going to be a good enough reason for the government to prohibit it. So let's take a look at some examples. Skiing, right? Skiing's fun, but it's also dangerous. You could harm yourself. But the fact that you could harm yourself isn't a good enough reason to outlaw it. Now, we can have rules about, if we're going to be all skiing together, where you can go, where you can't go, the kinds of things you can do, the kinds of things you can't do. But we can only rule out some of those things because they pose a danger to other people. They could harm other people. We can't stop someone from skiing in their backyard, right? Because, hey, they're not going to harm anyone else back there. They're welcome to do it. Smoking, right? Again, smoking in certain contexts, right? In a restaurant, in a workplace, could cause harm to other people. Right? You could be smoking in their face, giving them, the secondhand smoke. That can be prohibited, right? It potentially harms other people, but you can't stop someone from smoking maybe in their own home, right? Or outside, no one else around. You can't prohibit that. Drinking, right? No drinking and driving, but you can drink in the context of your own home, in your own yard, things like that. Go for it. You're allowed to do that. It's not harming anyone else. The government can't prohibit you from doing that. What about movies, right? R-rated movies. Maybe they have a lot of violence and gore. They have profanity. They have sexuality. Can we prohibit people from seeing certain kinds of movies? John Stuart Mill is going to say no. As long as watching that movies, you can, whatever you want to watch, maybe harms you in some sort of way, but if it's not harming other people, then you should be allowed to do it. Now, Mill does think we should make some exceptions in the case of children or barbaric societies. Basically, Mill's thinking there are some people who maybe can't make rational decisions for themselves. And I think, right, children's a good case. We don't allow children to smoke or drink or watch R-rated movies. We don't allow them to do those things, presumably because doing those things would be harmful to them, and they're not really rational enough to decide whether or not they want to incur those harms. Same with people in barbaric societies. Maybe we think they're not really rational to be able to make those decisions for themselves. Now, again, I think people can, these days think, well, maybe Mill's being kind of like racist or nationalist or something here, thinking that other people are sort of barbaric and Westerners, they know what's best for people. So I think maybe those exceptions for the barbaric kind of societies we're going to be less sympathetic to these days, but we still are pretty sympathetic to these exceptions for children. We do think that we can sort of decide for them what things they can and can't do. The sort of flip side of the harm principle is that governments are justified in requiring some behavior. They're justified in forcing you to do something only if requiring it is going to benefit other people. So Mill gives a couple examples here, right? So someone who's asked to testify in court, they can require you to tell the truth because it's going to have this benefit of getting the truth out or whatever. Maybe they are justified in requiring you to go to war because it's going to have benefits for other people. So the government can require you to do some things, but only when doing those things is going to have benefits. Now, the fact that an agent's action benefits him or herself, whether physically or morally, is not going to be a good enough reason for the government to require that thing. So again, let's look at some examples. You're allowed, right, in some sense, to smoke or drink or do all these dangerous behaviors. Can we allow people can we require them to do things to make themselves safer, right? And that's sort of the kind of question we're asking here. Can we require people to wear seatbelts? You know, only if the thought is it's going to benefit other people. So I'm not sure what Mill's going to say, right, about seatbelts. Right? Seems like he's not going to be thinking that we're justified in requiring them, unless we can explain how they benefit other people. Maybe, right, we can make some argument about how hospital costs or insurance costs will stay lower if everybody wears a seatbelt. Maybe we can justify them in that way. But sort of on its face, right, not wearing a seatbelt just harms you, and you're allowed to endanger yourself if you want to. Same with riding a motorcycle, right? Michael Sandel has this nice little video about, should we be requiring people to wear helmets when they ride a motorcycle? This guy, I wouldn't recommend riding a motorcycle like this. Not only not wearing a helmet, but also popping a wheelie. That's a recipe for disaster. But you might, there are places that require people to wear helmets. There are places that don't require motorcyclists to wear helmets. We can see in Mill a kind of argument that says, no, if people who are riding motorcycles want to injure themselves, we should allow them to do that, right? We have no right to sort of step in and force them to wear a helmet. And then maybe one that's maybe a bit more plausible or obvious to us, going to church. Could we require people to go to church because we think, well, that's morally good for them? Or some other sort of religious services or join a religious group? Mill's going to think, no, even if doing that would have benefits for those people, we can't require it unless doing it is going to have benefits for some other group. Now maybe, again, in this case, and in the motorcycling case, right, in all these cases, maybe we can make this sort of argument that if we required this thing, if we required people to go to church or wear helmets, that will have some long-term benefit to other people, to third parties. How tight does that connection have to be between the activity and the benefit in order to justify us in requiring it? That's a little bit unclear, right? Mill's not real specific about that, but presumably Mill would have thought the connection between wearing your helmet on a motorcycle, going to church, isn't going to be close enough that we can require people to do those things. All right, so this is a good time to sort of spend a minute to reflect. According to the harm principle, right, the government's justified in prohibiting behavior only if it harms others, and in requiring behavior only if it benefits others. Can we think of any counterexamples to this principle? Things where maybe the government can prohibit it even if it doesn't cause any harm to other people, or the government can require it even if it doesn't benefit any other people. So, pause the video, think about if you can come up with any examples here. All right, so one example, maybe the most obvious one, I give you sort of that example, smoking, drinking, and we might think there are just some drugs, right, that the government's going to be allowed to outlaw, heroin use, maybe certain medications, marijuana. There are a number of things which we might think, well, the government using those things doesn't necessarily harm anyone but the user, and the government does in fact outlaw them. Now the question is, are those laws justified? should the government be outlawing marijuana use? Maybe you think no. But when it comes to heroin use, maybe you're like, yeah, then the government's allowed to outlaw that. So we would want to think through, what should we think about laws against heroin use in light of Mill's arguments for the harm principle. Okay, now from there I want to turn to sort of Mill's arguments for the freedom of speech. So according to Mill, the harm principle justifies the following freedoms or liberties. First, the liberty of conscience. So if you can't prohibit something unless it harms other people, then we can't prohibit people from thinking certain things or from saying certain things, right? Because those thinking things, saying them, isn't harming anyone. So that's one sort of freedom or liberty that we get. Number two, the harm principle is going to justify freedom or liberty to pursue the kinds of activities that you want to pursue, to taste the kinds of things that you want to taste. Right? So, what do you like to do? Do you like to play volleyball, football? Do you like to lay around in your grass, roll down hills, blow bubbles? Whatever it is, you should be allowed to do it. Same with taste, right? You like tomatoes, you like cucumbers. I think those things are gross. Can I outlaw them? No, that's kind of bizarre, right? People can like the things that they like. You might really like some art that I don't like, or movies that I don't like, but we shouldn't be limiting people from pursuing the kinds of activities, aesthetic pleasures, and things like that that they enjoy. Finally, the harm principle for Mill is going to justify the freedom of association or assembly. Getting together with other people, maybe who are like-minded or who aren't like-minded, right? That doesn't harm anyone necessarily, right? So people should be free to do that. Okay. We're going to focus on that first one, the liberty of conscience, which Mill thinks sort of spills into or justifies, if we're able to think freely, we should also be able to speak, express ourselves freely. So here's Mill's argument. And this is kind of a clever argument. I like it. Premise one. Every claim, anything you can say, is either possibly true or certainly false. So there are some things that are true, other things that maybe aren't true but are at least possibly true, or there are going to be some things maybe that are certainly false, like we know are definitely not true. Now, if a claim is possibly true, then Mill thinks we should allow it. Because if it's possible that the thing's true, then we need to be able to consider it, and we need to be able to sort of figure out whether it's true or not. This process helps us figure out what is true at the end of the day, right? So if I have some controversial philosophical view, then I should be allowed to express it. So, I'm thinking of some view that I hold that's pretty controversial. It's wrong to eat animals, or it's wrong to drink cow's milk, or something like that. You might say, well, John, that's kind of a bizarre view. Like almost everyone thinks that's okay. And the thought is, well, it's at least possibly true. And so we should allow people to say it. Premise three. Now let's say, so the claims that are possibly true, we should allow people to say those. Let's say a claim is certainly false. We know it's got to be false. Should we allow people to say that too? Mill thinks, yeah, we should allow people to express the certainly false things. Why? Because doing so is going to help us remember why it's false. So say someone thinks, you know what, the Holocaust just never happened. So the Holocaust denier, right? It's not true that there was this mass murder of Jewish people in Nazi Germany. Now, you might think that's certainly false. It's not true. But Mill thinks if we don't allow people to say it and investigate, right, look at the evidence for thinking that the Holocaust did occur, then we're going to forget. And so like when someone years from now says, the Holocaust never occurred, we're not going to have the evidence that we need to prove them wrong. And so allowing people to say things, even things that are certainly false, they should be free to say those things, and that's going to help us remember why they're false. It's going to help us, give us a chance to get all the evidence together against it. All right, so that gets us to the conclusion that every claim is such that we should allow people to express it, right? If every claim is either possibly true or certainly false, if something could be true, we should allow people to express it. If something's certainly false, we should allow people to express it. So no matter what, we should allow people to say what they think. This is a pretty powerful argument, right? And with every argument, though, we want to evaluate, are the premises true? Premise 1 true, is premise 2 true, premise 3? Are those claims all true? The argument's valid, and so if we want to attack this claim, we've got to find which premise is false. So if the preceding argument is sound, that is valid, and it's got true premises, then the government's not justified in prohibiting any speech. That includes speech that's gross or offensive. So what are some examples? You might think of social media and hate speech, right? It's one thing, I think, for the government to prohibit people from saying certain things. It's another thing for Facebook to say, well, you can't say that here. You're allowed to say it somewhere else. But, I'm a private company, I'm Facebook, I don't want you saying that here. But Facebook does seem like it's open to the public. It's sort of quasi a public space. So I think Facebook's kind of an interesting case. But the general idea is that the government's going to allow people to say hateful things because we have this freedom of speech. We might not be able to allow them to say those things in certain contexts, but we're going to allow it, generally speaking. What about something like nudity? So, there's this debate over some people, I guess there was a couple big Supreme Court cases, well, at least one, that decided that, well, nudity is a kind of speech. It's speech in favor of a certain kind of lifestyle choice. And so even if we think it's gross or we're offended by it or something, it needs to be allowed, at least in certain cases, right? Maybe you can't be nude in context X in the middle of a big city, but we're going to reserve some beach spaces for nudity or something like that. Curse words, swearing, people saying really things in the heat of an argument that are mean. Well, that might be offensive or gross or mean or whatever, but maybe it's protected. Same with public displays of affection. Those are a kind of speech, we might think. And so we don't like it when people are kissing around us, making out. Oh man, that's disturbing, but maybe it's a kind of speech and we should protect that as well. So according to Mill, it looks like the government's not justified in prohibiting any speech. Is that true? Can you think of any counterexamples to the principle? Is there any speech that the government is justified in prohibiting? The answer to that question is I think yes. And at least in the US, we think the answer is yes. So let's look at some examples of speech that is outlawed. So here we got this picture, right? It says free speech, but there are some conditions, some things you can't say. So here are some exceptions. Defamation, right? You can't defame other people, say bad things about them, especially if those things are not true. Fighting words, you can't sort of incite people into a fight. Right? Maybe, right, Mill's going to say, because that causes harm, right? You lead people to get into a fight, there's harm, so maybe that's going to make sense on Mill's view. You can't give away government secrets. Right? Again, maybe there's a potential for harm there. Right? There are going to be some things you can't say. You can't create a hostile environment for workers by, for example, you're always insulting Democrats in your office, or you're always insulting Republicans or something. Also, right, the other obvious example is kind of sexual harassment or creating a hostile environment for racial minorities or something like that. You can't incite illegal conduct, right? This is not about like creating a fight, but rather like, hey, like let's all get together and burn down the library. You can't do that. Libel, you can't lie about someone in written speech. There are certain kinds of obscenities, some things that are just sort of beyond the pale that we're not going to allow. Slander, you can't lie about someone in spoken word. There are threats. You can't threaten people. Say, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to you. That kind of speech isn't protected. And then there are trade secrets, right? So you can't give away the recipe to McDonald's special sauce on the Big Mac or something like that. All right, so now some time for reflection. It's plausible that the government shouldn't prohibit behaviors that don't harm others, but Mill's harm principle faces some relatively strong objections. So Mill's harm principle sounds pretty plausible, but there are other sorts of activities like heroin use that maybe we think, yeah, maybe it is okay to prohibit that. So what should we think of the harm principle? Is it defensible? Is it not? That's a question that you should reflect on. Second, something similar can be said of Mill's argument for the freedom of speech. Right? It's very plausible that we should be able to say whatever we want to say, but there are also some pretty good objections to it, right? Some things that it seems like we shouldn't be able to say. So what should we think about the freedom of speech? What are its boundaries? What's wrong with Mill's argument? Where's the flaw? That's another thing we want to be thinking about. And in future videos, we're going to return to some of these questions and think, is there something wrong with the harm principle? Is there something wrong with Mill's argument for free speech? We'll investigate those questions further in another video. All right, that's it for now. See you later.